This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Opera Theatre of the Sydney Opera House and the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. I'm Stephen Crittenden, and today in this session we're asking whether the religious will inherit the earth. In 1992, in the immediate wake of the collapse of Soviet communism, Francis Fukuyama published a book with a very catchy, very hubristic title, The End of History. It was a product of a Whig view of history that saw everything as getting better and better, and history as basically a big march of progress. Liberal capitalism had defeated communism, and all the rest was going to be peacefully consuming. The age of ideology was over. A few years later, Fukuyama's former teacher at Harvard, Samuel Huntington, wrote an essay that became a book called The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. He said he'd written the book to shake his students out of their complacency, and the book argued that the next big wave of world conflict would be between civilizations and religions, Islam and the West, ultimately perhaps the West and China. Religion was back, but of course, as we know, it had never really gone away. And then September 11 happened, and Huntington's book, not Fukuyama's, has shaped debates about Islam and the West ever since. And I guess this is where Eric Kaufmann's extremely interesting and provocative book comes in. Eric is reader in politics at Birkbeck College at London University, and the book is entitled Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? And it provides a heady mixture of politics and religion and sociology and, above all, demographics. And he argues that we can see that the ultra-Orthodox in Israel or the Muslims in Europe or the religious right in the United States are on course to becoming very much more numerically significant and therefore very much more politically significant than they are now. Now, before I invite Eric to take the floor, let me just say that he's going to speak for 40 minutes approximately, and we've got microphones, one over here and one over here, and when he's finished speaking in about 40 minutes' time, you're invited to come to the microphone with your own questions and we'll keep the discussion going. So please welcome Eric Kaufmann.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here. It's a world-famous architectural icon. I also would like to thank the festival for bringing me here to Australia. This is my first time in Australia, and before I came, people told me that Sydney was a lot like my hometown of Vancouver, British Columbia. The difference, of course, is that in Vancouver we only get about 2 months of decent weather a year, even though I do know that out there it does look a bit like Vancouver right now. So I'd also like to thank the organizers of this wonderful, stimulating event, and Anne Mossop, Simon Longstaff, Helene Fox, Anna Hayward, and Pip Sprott have done a great job, and anything I've needed, they've been right there. Okay, so I just want to start off with some global demographic trends to sort of sketch the context for you of my book. We're living through, right now, the tail end of a very long population expansion. If you were to look at the line of human population growth, it sort of begins very, very slowly, nips upwards slightly with the birth of Christ, and then around 1700 we see this big spike in population, which I'll call the Great Population Explosion. And so the story of our species really has been one of expansion and growth. Out of Africa 40,000 years ago, spreading territorially, increasing in population. But according to the United Nations, in about 2085, world population will peak at 9 billion, and we will enter into a phase of global population contraction. The first time in human history where we have a voluntarily induced global population decline. And I want you to ponder the significance of that. So we have to ask ourselves, are the ideas that accompanied the big spike in population of the years 1700 to 2050 That is, the ideas of the Enlightenment, of liberalism and progress, necessarily going to be the same ideas that accompany the great contraction of human population that'll begin at the end of our century. Already we can see straws in the wind of the great shrinking, as I call it, of population. So the world's rural population has now, just in the past decade, begun to decline. That's an early indication. If we go to Europe, if we take the population of Europe, including Russia, it's expected to decline by 25 million in the next 20 years, and then between 2030 and 2050 by another 55 million. So you see there's an acceleration of population decline because total fertility rates, that is, the number of children a woman will bear in her lifetime, have been below replacement for 30 or 40 years. And so after the demographic momentum wears off, population begins to decline. As populations shrink, there are fewer mothers begetting fewer children and so forth, so you get a compounding effect and an acceleration of both population increase in a time of explosion and decrease in a time of shrinking and contraction. So, for example, a country such as Italy with a total fertility rate of 1.3, if that persists, in a century, Italy will be a quarter of the size that it is today in population. So that's an astounding shift caused by low fertility. And there are about 35 countries that are at a TFR, a total fertility rate of 1.3 or below in the world. And it's proven extremely difficult for governments in Southern and Eastern Europe and in East Asia, where fertility rates are at these very low rates, to get those rates up. They've been throwing money, baby bonuses, all kinds of tinkering with social policies, but it's very difficult to get those total fertility